My entitled neighbor paved over my garden to park his $150,000 RV, so I jackhammered the driveway and had the RV impounded. I was standing in my own driveway, staring at a massive, wet slab of industrial concrete that had completely swallowed 3 years of my life. The engine of a 40-foot luxury RV was idling just inches from my face, drowning out the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I had just driven 14 hours straight, returning from a grueling 10-day commercial mapping project out in the humid, mosquito-infested swamplands of the neighboring state. My boots were caked with dried mud, my lower back was screaming in agony from sleeping in cheap roadside motels, and the only thing keeping my eyes open was the singular, desperate anticipation of stepping into my backyard. I am a land surveyor by trade. For 50 hours a week, I exist in a chaotic world of muddy construction sites, screaming foremen, and multimillion-dollar land disputes. My brain operates entirely on numbers, angles, and absolute precision. Because of the daily chaos of my profession, I needed a sanctuary. I needed an environment where I controlled every single variable. That sanctuary was my Zen garden. Over the span of 3 years, I had poured thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of manual labor into a pristine strip of land running exactly along the northern boundary of my property. I didn't just plant a few bushes. I had excavated the soil, installed a subterranean, precision-timed drip irrigation system, and layered the earth with premium topsoil. I imported rare, shade-loving hostas that cost $50 a pop. I meticulously arranged smooth, black river stones around Japanese maples, raking the surrounding white sand every Sunday morning. It was a masterpiece of tranquility. It was the one place on this earth where the noise of the world simply ceased to exist. But as I stepped out of my truck, my heavy work boots hitting the pavement, my sanctuary was gone. In its place was a hideous, sprawling extension of my neighbor's driveway. A thick, crude slab of industrial-grade gray concrete stretched aggressively across the property line, completely obliterating my hostas, crushing my irrigation lines beneath tons of heavy aggregate, and suffocating the soil I had so carefully cultivated. My vision narrowed. I felt the heat rising in my neck and my vision went blurry with rage. I could literally smell the sharp, alkaline scent of freshly cured cement mixing with the exhaust of the behemoth parked on top of it. The behemoth belonged to Big Mike. Mike was the kind of guy who peaked in high school, inherited a moderately successful regional plumbing supply company from his father, and genuinely believed that his bank account exempted him from basic human decency. He drove a lifted truck he never used for work, he threw aggressively loud backyard barbecues until 3 in the morning on Tuesdays, and he operated under the assumption that the world was simply an extension of his own living room. I walked slowly toward the property line, my boots crunching over the dry, splashed concrete residue that now coated my grass. Mike was standing near the rear of the massive, gleaming white and chrome RV, casually hooking up a heavy-duty electrical cable to a brand-new outlet he had bolted to the side of his house. He was wearing a tight polo shirt, aviator sunglasses, and a smirk that made my knuckles crack involuntarily. "Mike," I ground out, my voice shaking with an anger I was trying desperately to leash. "What the hell is this?" He didn't even flinch. He casually turned around, wiped his hands on his cargo shorts, and gave me a lazy, infuriating grin. He walked over to the edge of the new slab and patted the concrete as if he were petting a loyal dog. "Hey, Parker, welcome back, buddy," he boomed, his voice entirely too loud. "Check out the new rig. 40 feet of pure luxury. Dual slide-outs, king bed, full outdoor kitchen. It's a beauty, isn't it?" I pointed a trembling finger at the ground. "You paved over my garden. You ripped out my irrigation system. You poured concrete 3 feet over the property line." Mike sighed, rolling his eyes dramatically as if I were a petulant child complaining about spilled milk. "Look, Parker, I needed a wider driveway to accommodate the new rig. The county has those stupid regulations about parking on the street, so I had to expand. I'd barely grazed your side. It was just a bunch of weeds and rocks anyway." "Those weeds were imported hostas," I hissed, taking a step closer. "And that's my property. You are trespassing." Mike let out a sharp, barking laugh. He crossed his arms over his chest, his smirk widening into a full-blown grin of absolute arrogance. "Look, Parker, it's already cured and reinforced with rebar. It's permanent now. Possession is 9/10 of the law, right? What are you gonna do? Spend 10 grand on a lawyer for a few feet of dirt? It's concrete, man. It's not going anywhere. Get over it." He turned his back on me, whistling an off-key tune as he walked back to his RV to finish plugging in the power cord. He honestly believed he had one. He believed that because he had already poured the concrete, I would simply fold, too intimidated by the cost and the legal headache to fight back. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten him. I didn't throw a punch, even though every muscle fiber in my body body was screaming at me to tackle him into the side of his oversized toy. I just stared at the back of his head, took a slow, deep breath, and turned around. I walked straight into my house, locked the door, and went straight to my home office. Mike had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed I was just a regular homeowner who would have to hire a surveyor and a lawyer to figure out where the invisible lines in the dirt actually lay. He completely forgot what I do for a living. I didn't need to hire a land surveyor. I am a licensed, bonded, and state-certified professional land surveyor. I measure the earth down to the millimeter. I testify in federal court regarding property boundary disputes. My stamp and signature are legally binding documents in this state. And exactly 6 months prior, when I was planning a future patio expansion in my backyard, I had performed a comprehensive, hyper-accurate topographic and boundary survey of my entire parcel. I pulled the heavy, rolled-up blueprints from my drafting table. I unrolled the large format paper, weighing down the corners with heavy brass plumb bobs. I traced my finger along the northern boundary line. The legal description was absolute. The iron pins marking the corners of our lots were set deep into the earth. I knew exactly, to the fraction of a decimal point, where my land ended and his began. I waited until 2 a.m. The neighborhood was dead quiet. I slipped out my back door dressed in dark clothes, carrying a high-lumen tactical flashlight and a steel tape measure. I walked softly toward the new concrete slab. I found the rear property pin, a rusty piece of rebar driven flush with the soil near the back fence. I pulled the tape measure taut, walking the line toward the front street. According to my measurements, Mike hadn't just grazed the line. He had poured his concrete exactly 3.12 feet onto my property, running a full 40 feet down the length of the boundary. He had stolen over 120 square feet of my land. But as I shined my flashlight along the edge of the crude concrete pour, the bright beam illuminated something else. Something that made a cold, sharp smile spread across my face in the darkness. In Mike's reckless rush to pour the concrete while I was out of town, his cheap, unlicensed contractors hadn't bothered to prep the site properly. They had just dumped the gravel, laid the rebar mat, and pumped the cement directly over the existing ground. And in doing so, they had completely buried the blue, cast-iron municipal water shutoff valve. This wasn't just my water valve. This was the primary emergency isolation valve that serviced the 3 houses down the block. Burying a municipal utility access point under a permanent concrete structure is a massive, severe violation of the city's building code and the Department of Public Works regulations. That's when the real bombshell dropped. I moved the beam of my flashlight up from the buried valve to the massive, gleaming side of the luxury RV. Because the RV was so incredibly wide, and because Mike had deployed the hydraulic slide-outs to show off the interior to his friends earlier that evening, the sheer mass of the vehicle wasn't just resting on the trespassing concrete. The tires were planted firmly on the slab, but the massive fiberglass body of the rig was overhanging past the concrete, casting a heavy shadow another 2 full feet into the grass of my remaining yard. Legally speaking, an unauthorized vehicle encroaching into the vertical airspace of a privately owned residential property without the owner's consent is classified as an illegal and abandoned vehicle. Mike had just handed me the keys to his own destruction. Friday morning, I didn't call a lawyer. I poured myself a black coffee and dialed the direct line to the City Water Department's Emergency Infrastructure Division. I spoke to a very tired, very bureaucratic supervisor named Helen. I calmly explained that a neighbor had engaged in unpermitted concrete work and had encased the primary emergency isolation valve in 6 inches of steel-reinforced concrete. Helen asked for photos. I emailed her a high-resolution, beautifully lit photograph of the slab, with an arrow digitally drawn pointing to the exact GPS coordinates of the buried valve. Within 2 hours, an emergency notice of violation and order to abate was stapled to Mike's front door by a thoroughly annoyed city inspector. The notice demanded immediate removal of the obstruction, carrying a fine of $500 a day until the valve was accessible. But Mike wasn't home. He had gone to the lake for the weekend in his truck, leaving his precious RV parked exactly where it was. My next stop was Sunbelt Rentals. I walked up to the counter and smiled at the clerk. "I need the biggest gas-powered, diamond blade concrete saw you have in your inventory. The walk-behind model with the water suppression tank. I also need your heaviest commercial electric jackhammer, 3 extra spade bits, and a heavy-duty wheelbarrow." The clerk raised an eyebrow, ringing up the heavy machinery. "Tackling a big patio job this weekend, man?" "No," I replied smoothly, signing the rental agreement. "Just doing some highly localized landscaping." I loaded the heavy, yellow machinery into the bed of my truck, stopped at the gas station to buy 2 massive, gallon-sized bottles of Glacier Freeze Gatorade, and headed home. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp, cool breeze. The sun was just barely peeking over the horizon at 6 a.m. The neighborhood was silent, save for the distant chirping of early morning birds. I walked out of my garage carrying my professional surveying total station, a hyper-accurate, laser-guided optical instrument mounted on a heavy wooden tripod. I set it up over the front property pin, leveling the internal bubbles with absolute precision. I sent my laser down the boundary line to the rear pin. I pulled a hot pink masonry chalk box from my tool belt. I snapped a blindingly bright pink chalk line directly across the surface of Mike's fresh concrete. The line was accurate to within a single millimeter of the legal property boundary. Everything on the right side of that pink line belonged to Mike. Everything on the left side of that pink line, exactly 3.12 feet of steel reinforced concrete, was a permanent fixture affixed to my land. Under state property law, a permanent fixture installed on your land becomes your legal property. I legally owned that concrete, but I couldn't cut it yet. The sheer weight of the 3-ton RV was currently resting heavily on the slab, its massive frame overhanging the pink chalk line by a solid 2 feet. At exactly 7 a.m., a massive, Peterbilt heavy-duty commercial wrecker turned down my street, its diesel engine grumbling low and menacing. The air brakes hissed violently as the colossal truck backed into my driveway. The driver, a burly guy named Sal with grease stained into the deep lines of his hands, jumped out of the cab. He looked at the massive RV, then looked at me, scratching his beard. "Listen, buddy," Sal rasped, pulling a clipboard from his vest. "I can tow anything on wheels, but I don't get involved in neighbor disputes. I need proof this rig is parked illegally on your property, or I ain't touching it. The liability on a $150,000 coach is too high." I calmly handed Sal a manila folder. Inside was a certified, stamped copy of my topographic boundary survey, my state surveyor's license, the property deed, and a printed photograph clearly showing the RV physically crossing the property boundary. I pointed to the glowing pink chalk line dissecting the concrete, and then pointed straight up to the fiberglass body of the RV jutting violently over the line. "The vehicle is unauthorized, unattended, and encroaching on private residential property," I stated clearly, citing the exact municipal towing ordinance. "I am the property owner, and I am authorizing the immediate removal of this trespassing vehicle." Sal studied the paperwork. He looked at the pink line. He looked back at the paperwork. A slow, appreciative grin spread across his face. "Well, damn. You don't mess around, do you?" "Not when it comes to my garden, Sal." It took Sal 20 minutes to rig the heavy nylon straps under the front axle of the RV. He bypassed the electronic parking brakes, hooked the massive hydraulic winch to the frame, and slowly, agonizingly, dragged the pristine, luxury land yacht out of the driveway. The suspension groaned, the tires squeaked against the concrete, and I stood there, sipping my Gatorade, watching 3 tons of Mike's entitlement being hauled down the street. Because it was a commercial heavy wrecker call on a Sunday morning, Sal informed me he was taking it to their primary impound lot, 40 miles away, across the county line. As the taillights of the tow truck disappeared around the corner, I checked my watch. 8 a.m. Time to work. I walked over to the massive, yellow walk-behind concrete saw. I primed the engine, choked the carburetor, and pulled the starter cord. The heavy gas engine roared to life, shattering the peaceful Sunday morning silence with a violent, deafening mechanical scream. I engaged the water pump, sending a steady stream of liquid over the massive, 14-inch diamond-studded steel blade to keep the dust down. I lined the spinning blade up perfectly with the pink chalk line. I gripped the heavy handles, braced my boots against the pavement, and slowly lowered the screaming diamond blade into the slab. The noise was apocalyptic. The screech of diamond grit tearing through dense aggregate and Portland cement echoed off the siding of the houses. A thick, gray slurry of wet concrete dust sprayed aggressively against my work boots. When the blade hit the thick steel rebar Mike had bragged about, a shower of bright orange sparks erupted from the trench, hissing violently as they hit the water stream. I pushed the heavy machine forward, inch by agonizing inch, walking the absolute edge of my property line. I felt the powerful vibrations tearing through my forearms, rattling my teeth in my skull, but I didn't stop. I made a deep, surgical cut exactly 3.12 feet from the edge of the pour, running all 40 feet down the boundary. When the cut was finished, I killed the engine. The sudden silence was ringing in my ears. But I wasn't done. I dragged the commercial electric jackhammer to the edge of the slab. I plugged it into my heavy-duty generator, planted the heavy steel spade bit directly into the center of the 3.12-foot trespassing section, and pulled the trigger. The jackhammer unleashed a brutal, staccato assault. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The concrete, now entirely severed from the main driveway by my surgical cut, had no structural integrity. It shattered instantly. Huge, jagged cracks spiderwebbed across the gray surface. I leaned my entire body weight into the machine, letting the heavy steel bit pulverize the slab. I broke the concrete into massive, 50-pound, fist-sized chunks. I ripped the steel rebar out of the earth with my bare, gloved hands, tossing the twisted metal aside. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My muscles burned with lactic acid. But every time I shattered a piece of that concrete, I saw my crushed hostas. I saw my broken irrigation lines. I saw Mike's smug, arrogant face telling me to get over it. The physical labor wasn't exhausting, it was pure, unadulterated catharsis. Now, normally, when you demolish concrete, you load it into a wheelbarrow, dump it into a roll-off dumpster, and pay a disposal fee to haul it away. But I didn't haul it away. As I established earlier, any permanent fixture attached to my property legally belonged to me. The concrete was mine, and as the legal owner of those jagged, heavy chunks of concrete, I had the absolute right to store my property wherever I saw fit on my own land. I hauled the heavy, broken chunks of rubble one by one. I didn't just throw them in a pile. I meticulously stacked them. I used my surveying string line to ensure I was building completely plumb and level. I stacked the jagged, gray rocks exactly 1 millimeter to the left of the pink chalk line. I built a localized, 4-foot-high, 2-foot-thick dry stacked masonry wall running the entire width of Mike's driveway. And because of the angle of our properties, this massive, impenetrable barricade of jagged concrete rubble was positioned directly, squarely in front of Mike's closed garage door. I had just finished placing the final, heavy capstone on my newly constructed rubble wall, wiping a streak of gray sludge from my forehead, when the front door of Mike's house violently flew open. Mike came stumbling out onto his porch, wearing nothing but a pair of loose gym shorts and a t-shirt stained with coffee. His hair was sticking up in every direction, his eyes wide and bloodshot from whatever late-night activities he had partaken in. He stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the empty space where his $150,000 RV had been parked. He looked at the massive, 40-foot trench of exposed earth where 1/3 of his brand-new driveway used to be. He looked at the 4-foot-high medieval barricade of jagged rubble currently trapping his wife's luxury SUV inside their garage. And then, he looked at me. I was sitting casually on the tailgate of my truck, my mud-caked boots dangling over the edge, calmly unscrewing the cap off a bottle of Glacier Freeze Gatorade. "Parker!" Mike screamed, his voice cracking an octave in sheer, unadulterated panic. His face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of purplish red. "Where is my rig? What did you do to my driveway? I'm calling the police. I'm having you arrested for grand theft auto. I'm suing you for vandalism. You're going to prison, you psychotic freak." He practically ripped his cell phone out of his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it on the grass, frantically punching in 911. I didn't say a word. I just took a long, refreshing chug of my Gatorade, enjoying the cool morning breeze. Less than 10 minutes later, a local police cruiser came tearing down the street, its light bar flashing aggressively. The cruiser parked at a harsh angle blocking the street, and a stern-looking officer stepped out, resting his hand casually on his duty belt. His name tag read Officer Miller. Mike practically sprinted toward the cop, spitting as he yelled, "Officer, arrest him, right now. He stole my 40-foot motorhome. He brought heavy machinery onto my property and destroyed a $10,000 driveway. Look at this wall. He trapped my wife's car. Put him in cuffs." Officer Miller held up a hand, stopping Mike's frantic tirade. He looked at the massive trench. He looked at the perfectly straight pink chalk line. He looked at the wall of rubble. Then, he walked slowly over to my truck. "Morning, sir," Officer Miller said, his tone perfectly neutral. "Care to explain what's going on here?" I hopped off the tailgate. "Good morning, officer. Nothing illegal, I assure you." I handed Officer Miller the same manila folder I had given Sal, the tow truck driver. "I am a state-certified professional land surveyor," I explained, pointing to my official stamp on the documents. "This is a registered topographic boundary survey. As you can see, marked by the pink chalk line which correlates exactly with the steel property pins driven into the earth. The concrete in question was poured over 3 feet onto my private property without my consent." Officer Miller opened the folder, reviewing the documents with a trained eye. "Furthermore," I continued, handing him the second piece of paper, "here is an emergency notice of violation issued by the City Water Department on Friday. The property owner at this residence conducted unpermitted construction and illegally encased a municipal emergency water shutoff valve under a permanent concrete structure." I pointed to the deep trench I had excavated. There, sitting perfectly unharmed in the damp earth, was the bright blue cast iron lid of the city water valve, finally exposed to the sunlight. Officer Miller walked over to the trench. He looked down at the exposed valve. He looked at the pink chalk line perfectly severing the driveway. He looked back at Mike, who was practically hyperventilating on the grass. "What about my motorhome?" Mike shrieked, pointing at the empty space. "He stole it. That's a federal offense." "I didn't steal anything," I replied calmly. "An unauthorized, unregistered vehicle was physically encroaching onto the vertical airspace of my private property. I utilized my legal right under Municipal Code 14.02 to have an unauthorized vehicle removed by a licensed commercial towing agency." Officer Miller closed the manila folder and handed it back to me. He turned to face Mike, his expression completely devoid of any sympathy. "Sir," Officer Miller said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet street, "this is a civil matter regarding property boundaries. From what I can see, this gentleman has extensive documentation proving that he is simply removing a localized debris field from his own private garden." "A debris field?" Mike screamed, pointing wildly at the barricade blocking his garage. "He built a dam fortress in front of my house. He destroyed my property. Actually, Thankfully, the officer corrected him sharply. Since the concrete was poured on his land, it legally belongs to him. If you want your concrete back, it's currently in that pile. And as for your vehicle, I suggest you call the county impound lot. Though, since it required a commercial heavy wrecker on a Sunday, I'd expect the release fee to be substantial. Mike's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The smug, arrogant smirk that he had worn just 2 days prior was completely erased, replaced by the crushing, devastating realization that his sense of entitlement had just violently collided with a man who measured his life in millimeters. Officer Miller tipped his hat to me, got back into his cruiser, and slowly drove away, leaving Mike standing in the ruins of his own arrogance. The financial aftermath for Big Mike was catastrophic. When he finally tracked down his luxury RV at the commercial impound lot 40 miles away, he was hit with an emergency weekend heavy wrecker deployment fee, mileage charges, and a daily storage fee. To get his massive rig out of hock, he had to write a cashier's check for just over $2,000. But that was just the beginning. The city was not nearly as forgiving as I was. Because Mike had flagrantly violated the building codes and buried a critical piece of municipal infrastructure, the city forced him to hire a licensed, bonded commercial contractor to completely rip out and repour the entirety of his remaining driveway to ensure the water valve was brought up to code with a proper steel access hatch. Between the city fines, the contractor fees, and the engineering permits, Mike was out another $5,000. His wife was so furious about her SUV being trapped behind my rubble wall that she made Mike carry every single 50-pound chunk of broken concrete to the curb by himself, by hand, so the city waste management could haul it away for an extra bulk trash fee. It took him 3 days of backbreaking, sweaty labor to clear the barricade. I sat on my front porch the entire time, drinking iced tea, offering him a Gatorade every time he looked like he was about to pass out from exhaustion. He never accepted. As for my garden, I decided against replanting the rare hostas. They were too fragile, too susceptible to the careless whims of entitled neighbors. Instead, I rented a post-hole digger. I drilled deep, cylindrical holes into the earth, spaced exactly 2 feet apart, running the entire 40-foot length of the property line. I filled those holes with high-strength Portland cement and embedded heavy-gauge, Schedule 40 steel pipes deep into the earth. I encased the steel pipes in smooth, architectural concrete forms. I built a permanent row of commercial-grade, steel-reinforced security bollards. They are capable of stopping a 3-ton vehicle moving at 40 miles an hour dead in its tracks. I painted them a polite, pristine, zen-like white. They are positioned exactly 1 inch inside my property line. Mike doesn't throw loud parties anymore. He doesn't park his truck on the street. When he backs his massive luxury RV into his newly compliant, incredibly narrow driveway, he has to hire a spotter just to ensure he doesn't scrape a millimeter of paint off the side of his rig against my impenetrable white bollards. Every time I look out my window and see those brilliant white pillars standing guard over my land, I feel that same sense of perfect, uninterrupted tranquility that my garden used to bring me. The variables are controlled. The boundary is absolute. Am I the monster here, or did he get exactly what he deserved?
If you have made it this far and want to see more videos like this, then kindly subscribe and turn on notifications so you may never miss another story like this.